As a writer, my biggest fear is boring my readers. I want to make sure my writing stays exciting and compelling so they keep turning pages, so they keep reading, so they get to the end, so they tell their friends about my book. Over the years, I've learned 4 simple tricks that if you do these, you'll automatically add a ton of excitement to your writing, no matter what the genre is or what kind of story you're telling. So let's jump in and look at the first one. Trick number 1, how long should the story last for your characters? I was working with a writer recently, helping him plan out his story, and he's telling an action story that centers around a heist. So he laid out this story for me, told me all about it, and I said, well, how long is this story going to last for your characters? In the story, how much time is going to pass? He said, needs about 2 weeks. I'm like, 2 weeks? What? Could you tell the story in less time? He's like, well, probably. I said, how about a week? He's like, yeah, I could do a week. I said, how about 3 days? And he started looking nervous, but he's like, probably, make that happen. I go, I think the book should last 24 hours. And he got really nervous and he's like, can we really do that? I don't know. What about this? What about that? So I said, let's just give it a try. As we work through your book, let's try to make it work in 24 hours. And what happened is we got so much more excitement out of the story, so much more tension, so much more conflict, because everything was in a huge hurry, because this story that he originally saw as happening over 2 weeks was now only happening in 1 day. So here's the trick. Shorten the amount of time in your story as much as possible. Here's my rule of thumb. Start with an hour. Tell your entire story. It doesn't matter if it's 100,000 words or 200,000 words or longer. Can you make the whole story only last an hour? And if you need to make it longer, make sure you have a really good reason. Now, of course, there are masterworks written that only last an hour, or 1 day, or a week, or a month, or a year, or lifetimes. I'm not saying that your story has to be short, but it should only be longer if there's a really good reason that it has to be longer because of the story you're trying to tell. Because if you cram the story into a shorter period of time, it ups the tension for your characters, it ups them being in a hurry, constantly having to go after something. It pushes the action forward, and you get tons of free excitement in your story. So that's trick number 1. Cram the story in as little time as possible that your particular writing needs. To get to trick number 2, we're going to look at the relationships between the characters in your book. When I was working on my latest book, I started laying out all the characters, and then I started looking at, well, how can I build a web inside of these characters where they're all connected to each other in different ways? I don't want just the protagonist and a bunch of random characters coming off of that protagonist. I wanted to take each character and, as much as I possibly could, connect them to other characters in the story. I wanted to add dimensionality to the relationships, and I wanted to make sure that every single relationship was only 1 degree of separation from every other relationship in the story. This is why so many stories have characters in them where they're brothers or sisters or cousins, or it's a grandfather, or it's an old college roommate, or my best friend when I was in school, or it's my wife's cousin got married to my best friend. If you add these kinds of relationships, it adds a dimensionality to your book that ups the excitement. So for instance, in my most recent book, The Shithead, coming out September of this year, I have the main character, Eric, and I needed a character who was a business frenemy. So a good friend of his that was also in business but successful. So I added this guy named Anil on, based on a guy that I know in real life. And so then they were good friends, but I wanted to up the tension between them and make him show up in places that he normally wouldn't show up. So I had him become an old college buddy of my protagonist, and because of that, he also knew my protagonist's wife and his kids. So he's a long family friend. So he doesn't just show up in business relationships, he's now showing up in personal relationships as well. He shows up at birthday parties, for instance. Also, I made a 1 degree separation connection to somebody else that Eric knew that put them in a position where Anil and Eric were then competing against each other. And so now we have an old college roommate that's competing with his other college roommate who's also friends with the wife and the kids, and he's also friends and colleagues with another mutual business friend. You see where I'm going here, where now this ups the tension and conflict. And because I'm creating a web, Anytime there's conflict between two characters, it reverberates out and creates conflict and tension with the other characters. So by making sure your characters aren't one-off, but they're connected to lots of other characters in the story, you're going to add a lot of excitement, a lot of tension for the reader, and they're going to feel that emotional pull as they see things happening with your characters. So when you're planning out your characters, make sure they have multiple connections to multiple characters in your story so that anytime something happens, it reverberates out through those web of relationships. All right, so now let's get to trick number 3. And to do this, we're going to talk about exposition. That's the part of your writing that is the setting, the character's background, descriptions, basically anything that is not action and dialogue. A couple months ago, I was reviewing a scene from one of the students in our workshops, and right at the beginning of the scene was all this exposition, all this information. Some of it you needed as a reader, some of it you didn't, but it was all just kind of crammed in there, and we called this info dumping, when we just put tons of information on the reader all at one time. Now you have to remember, your reader is always wanting to know what happens next. That's what they're reading for. They want to know what happens next. They don't want to hear tons and tons of descriptions of things, tons and tons of background that have nothing to do with the story and what happens next. So inside this one trick about limiting exposition, I've got 2 mini tricks, and these are the things I do to make sure I don't overwhelm my reader with exposition. The first one is minimum viable exposition. Anytime I'm putting exposition on the page, I have to ask myself, does the reader absolutely need to know this to not get lost in what happens next and what's going on in the story? If they don't need to know it, I cut it. This ensures the pacing of your story stays fast. You're not dumping a bunch of information on your reader that they don't actually need to know in order to stay up on what's going on in your story. So minimum viable exposition. Always be thinking, how little information can I put in my writing so that I can keep the story moving? And that leads to my mini trick number 2, which is just-in-time exposition. So a lot of times, even if a writer is giving information the reader absolutely needs to know, they jam it all at the beginning of a scene or the beginning of a big portion of scenes or sequence of scenes, and they just put a ton of exposition, basically telling them everything they're going to need to know in the next few scenes. Don't do that. Do just-in-time exposition. Tell the reader what they need to know right when they need to know it. This allows you to thread your exposition through all of the action and dialogue, keep the story moving so that the reader doesn't end up skimming important parts of your writing. So, minimum viable exposition and just-in-time exposition keeps you from just info dumping on your reader, having them skim and potentially close the book. So this is how you get your exposition in while keeping your writing exciting. All right, let's look at trick number 4. We talk all the time on this channel about how your protagonist has to have a clear object of desire, something they want that they're actively pursuing. So in every scene, your protagonist is pursuing their object of desire. All their actions, all their dialogue should be in pursuit of their object of desire. So how do you add excitement to this part of the book as well? Well, just start throwing monkey wrenches into all of their plans. So you have to remember that the antagonist of your story is not the villain or the bad guy. A force of antagonism is anything that gets in the way of your protagonist getting their object of desire. And when I'm reviewing scenes for our workshops, I see this over and over where the protagonist just kind of floats through and gets what they want. That's boring. That's not exciting. We don't actually see the protagonist struggling. So all you have to do is, as your protagonist is pursuing their object of desire, don't let them have it. Keep putting things in their way, different forces of antagonism that keep them from getting what they want. And if you really want to turn this up to 11, have them have a really good plan for how they're going to get what they want. That immediately falls apart and they have to start improvising and figuring out what to do next. And this works across genre. I've been studying lots of different stories from society to performance to love to action, and I just see this happening over and over and over. The protagonist is trying to get what they want and they can't get it. That's what ups the excitement and helps the reader empathize with the protagonist and really care about what happens next. If you want to watch some master classes in progressive complications, go back to the Mission Impossible movies. Start with number 4, Ghost Protocol, and just watch all of them and notice how every time Ethan Hunt makes a plan, it immediately starts falling apart. He has to start improvising, and the action and excitement just keep going up and up and up. So that's it. 4 simple tricks that'll add tons of excitement to your writing. First, shorten the amount of time the story takes place for your characters to as little as possible to get your story told. Second, make sure your characters' relationships are multidimensional and they're connected to other characters in the story. Third, avoid info dumping with minimum viable exposition and just-in-time exposition. And finally, fourth, make sure your protagonist has a clear object of desire and then keep throwing forces of antagonism in their way. If you want to keep going further down this rabbit hole of how to tell great stories, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you get notified of all future videos. If this video was helpful at all, make sure you hit like and leave a comment telling which one of the 4 tricks was your favorite. I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you want to get more from StoryGrid, make sure you go to storygrid.com. Check out all the free resources we have available there. Sign up for our newsletter. That's where we send out all the latest and greatest stuff. If you're wondering who I am, my name is Tim Grahl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid. I'm the author of The Threshing, Running Down Your Dream in Your First 1,000 Copies. My partner, Shawn Coyne, is the creator and founder of StoryGrid, and everything I teach on this channel and everything we do at StoryGrid is based on his 30-plus years as a writer and editor. And finally, as always, thanks for being a writer. Thanks for being a part of our community here at StoryGrid, and I'll see you next time.